Rain hammered the window of Ashworth Hall the night Eleanor Ashworth signed a name that was not her own. Her hand did not shake. She had trained it not to. For 3 years she had written figures into ledgers meant for her father's eyes only, and now she was writing something far more dangerous than numbers. She was writing the truth about a flood that could ruin 200 families, and she was about to send that truth to the one man in the county who would never believe a woman had written it. Edmund Ashworth sat across from her in a chair too large for his shrinking frame, his breath rattling with the illness that had taken hold of him that winter. He watched his daughter fold the report into a leather case and did not stop her. He had stopped pretending to manage the estate himself 2 years earlier. He only signed his name where she told him to sign it, and even that he could barely manage now. "They will come for the land by spring," Eleanor said, not looking up from the case. "The Duke's men have already staked the northern boundary. If they dig the new drainage channel where they intend to dig it, the water will not go around Marsh Hollow, it will go through it." "And you are certain," her father said, "that a duke will read 40 pages written by a girl he has never met?" "He will read 40 pages written by you," she said. "He will never know the hand that held the pen." Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the old glass like something demanding to be let in. Eleanor did not flinch at the sound. She had grown used to storms that came without warning, both the kind that fell from the sky and the kind that arrived in the shape of men who believed they already knew everything worth knowing about land, water, and who was fit to speak about either. She had not always lived this way, hiding her mind behind her father's failing signature. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Edmund Ashworth had been the one striding across the fields with the surveyors, calling out measurements while his daughter trailed behind him carrying nothing more important than his coat. But illness does not ask permission before it changes a household, and by the time Eleanor turned 19, she was the one calling out the measurements, and her father was the one who needed the coat. Nobody outside the estate knew this. Nobody outside the estate was meant to know this. Ashworth land had never been grand. It sat in the shadow of a much larger and much wealthier estate belonging to the Duke of Rothmere, a man Eleanor had glimpsed only twice in her life, both times from a distance, both times surrounded by so many attendants that he seemed less like a person and more like the center of a small, moving crowd. She knew him mostly through reputation. He was said to be exacting, quick to judge, and utterly certain of his own correctness on any matter involving land, business, or the running of an estate. He was also, by every account she had heard, not a cruel man. Simply a man who had never once been forced to imagine that someone smaller than him, quieter than him, or less visible than him might understand something he did not. That certainty was about to be tested, though he did not yet know it. The dispute between the two estates had begun the way most disputes over land begin, with a difference of opinion dressed up as a difference of fact. The Duke's engineers wanted to cut a new drainage channel along the boundary between the properties, redirecting water that had, for generations, spread gently across the low fields during heavy rains and soaked harmlessly into the earth. The engineers argued that the new channel would protect the Duke's higher fields from flooding. What they had not accounted for, or had not cared to account for, was where all that redirected water would actually go once it left Rothmere land. It would go to Marsh Hollow. It would go to the 12 tenant families who lived along the lower fields of Ashworth land, families whose small stone cottages sat exactly where the water would collect if the natural drainage pattern was disturbed. Eleanor had walked that boundary more times than she could count, in dry seasons and wet ones, watching how the land breathed with the water instead of fighting it. She had spoken to the tenant families herself, sitting in their kitchens, drinking their tea, listening to stories of floods from 30 years earlier, before the natural channels had been left alone to do their quiet work. Nobody at Rothmere had spoken to those families. Nobody at Rothmere, as far as Eleanor could tell, had walked the lower fields at all. She had tried once to raise these concerns through the proper channels. She had drafted a short letter under her father's name, addressed to the Duke's land agent, mentioning the drainage concerns in careful, deferential language. The reply had come back within a week, brief and polite and utterly dismissive, thanking Mr. Ashworth for his interest in the matter and assuring him that the Duke's engineers were the finest in the region and had already accounted for every possible outcome. They had not. Eleanor knew this the way she knew the shape of her own hand. She had studied the old estate maps, the rainfall records her grandfather had kept for 40 years, the slope of every field between the two properties. She understood the land the way some people understood music, hearing patterns in it that others simply could not hear. So she had done the only thing left to do. She had written the report herself in full, holding nothing back. 40 pages of measurements, maps, rainfall data, and first-hand accounts from the tenant families, laid out with the precision of an engineer and the clarity of someone who had nothing to gain from flattery. She had written what needed to be said, not what a young duke might want to hear, and she had signed it with her father's trembling hand guiding the pen just enough to make the signature look like his own. Now the report sat in its leather case, waiting to be delivered. "You should sleep," her father said quietly, watching her seal the case shut. "Tomorrow will require you to be sharp." "I will sleep when the report is on its way," Elena answered not unkindly. She had long ago stopped resenting her father's illness, though she sometimes resented the world that had made it necessary for her to hide behind him. There was no time for resentment now. There was only the work in front of her, and the water that would not wait for anyone's permission before it began to rise. She thought briefly of what would happen if the Duke discovered the truth. Not the truth about the drainage, which she was certain of, but the truth about who had written the words he was about to read. She imagined his face, whatever it looked like up close, twisting into something between disbelief and irritation. She imagined him tossing the report aside the moment he learned a woman's hand had drafted it, dismissing months of careful work because of who had done the work rather than what the work said. She had imagined this so many times that the fear of it had worn smooth, like a stone rubbed by water until it no longer had any sharp edges left to cut her. She would send the report anyway, not because she was certain he would listen, but because the tenant families could not wait for her to be certain of anything. The next morning, Elena rode into the village herself, the leather case tied carefully behind her saddle, and delivered it into the hands of a messenger bound for Rothmere Hall. She did not linger to watch him ride away. She turned her horse back toward Ashworth Land and did not look over her shoulder, though some small, stubborn part of her wanted to. She told herself the report would speak for itself, that the numbers and the maps and the words she had chosen so carefully would carry their own weight regardless of whose hand had written them. She told herself this all the way home, and she almost believed it. What she could not have known, riding back through the wet fields under a sky still heavy with the last of the storm, was that the report was about to land in the hands of a man who prided himself on reading people as easily as he read documents, and that something about this particular document was about to unsettle him in a way he did not yet have words for. Julian Rothmere received the leather case 2 days later, delivered along with a stack of other correspondence he had little interest in reading that morning. He nearly set it aside unopened, assuming it was another tenant complaint dressed up in formal language, the kind his agents were paid to handle so that he did not have to trouble himself with every small grievance from every small estate bordering his own. Something made him open it anyway. Perhaps it was the weight of the case, heavier than he expected for what he assumed would be a short letter. Perhaps it was simply boredom, the restless irritation of a man used to being busy who had, for one quiet morning, nothing pressing enough to occupy his mind. He untied the case and drew out the report, and within the first page, his irritation began to shift into something else entirely. The Duke was not a foolish man, whatever else might be said of him. He had been raised to understand land, taught from boyhood to read a field the way other men read a ledger, and he recognized competent work when he saw it. This was not merely competent. The measurements were precise, cross-referenced against rainfall records he had not known existed, and the maps included details his own engineers had somehow failed to note, small variations in elevation that would determine, with almost mathematical certainty, exactly where redirected water would travel. He read through the first 10 pages standing at his desk, then sat down slowly, still reading, the rest of his morning correspondence forgotten entirely. Whoever had written this had walked the land, not once but many times in different seasons, in different weather. Whoever had written this had spoken to the families who lived there, had recorded their accounts with a care that suggested genuine respect rather than mere procedure. Whoever had written this had anticipated every objection his own engineers might raise, and had answered each one before it could even be spoken aloud. By the time he reached the final page, Julian Rothmere had gone from irritation to something close to admiration, though he would not have called it that at the time. He called it something closer to grudging respect, the kind one professional offers another when confronted with work that cannot be dismissed, no matter how much one might wish to dismiss it. He called for his steward, a steady, gray-haired man named Hargrove who had served the family for over 20 years, and had long since learned when to speak plainly to his employer and when to simply listen. "This came from Ashworth," the Duke said, tapping the report against his palm. "I did not know Edmund Ashworth had it in him to produce work of this quality. I had heard he was ill." "He is, Your Grace," Hargrove said carefully, "quite ill from what I understand. He rarely leaves the house these days." The Duke frowned, turning the pages back to the beginning as though searching for some clue he had missed. Then he must have hired someone, some clerk, or a land agent brought in from outside the county. This is not the work of a man too sick to walk his own fields. "Perhaps, Your Grace, whoever it is understands this land better than my own engineers," the Duke said, and there was something almost reluctant in his voice, as though the admission cost him more than he wished it to. "This is a man's work, Hargrove, careful, disciplined. Whoever wrote it did not simply guess at the outcome. He proved it." Hargrove said nothing to that, though something in his expression flickered, brief and unreadable, before settling back into its usual careful neutrality. He had lived long enough near the Ashworth estate to have heard certain quiet rumors, the kind that travel between servants and tenants but rarely reach the ears of men like the Duke. He had heard more than once that it was not Edmund Ashworth who rode the boundary lines these days, checking the water levels after every heavy rain. He said nothing of this to the Duke. It was not his place, and besides, he could not be certain the rumors were true. So he simply nodded and let his employer continue turning the pages, admiring work whose true author remained, for now, entirely hidden from him. The Duke set the report down at last and looked toward the window, toward the fields that stretched out gray and wet under the retreating storm clouds. He thought briefly of summoning Edmund Ashworth to Rothmere Hall to discuss the findings directly, then reconsidered, remembering the man's illness. He would go to Ashworth instead. It seemed the more respectful course, given the quality of the report and the clear effort behind it. He did not yet know that the true author of that effort would be the one to receive him, standing quietly in a doorway, watching him arrive with an expression far more guarded than anything he had learned to read in all his years of reading land, ledgers, and men. For now, Julian Rothmere simply believed what was easiest to believe. That somewhere within Ashworth Hall, some capable man had done careful, disciplined work, the kind he respected, the kind he was prepared to act on. He had no reason yet to imagine otherwise, and every reason to assume the world worked the way it had always worked for him, with men doing the thinking and the measuring, and women, when they appeared at all, doing little more than standing quietly nearby. He would learn differently soon enough, but that morning, folding the report closed and setting it aside with something close to satisfaction, he still believed the comfortable version of the story, the one where the world matched his expectations exactly. Eleanor, riding the boundary line that same afternoon to check the water levels after the storm, had no idea her words were already sitting on a desk at Rothmere Hall, already read, already respected, already misunderstood in the one way that mattered most. She only knew that the rain had stopped, that Marsh Hollow had not flooded this time, and that somewhere a decision was being made about the fate of the land she loved, a decision she had shaped with her own hand and her own mind, though no one on the other side of that boundary yet knew it. She rode home slowly, watching the water settle back into its familiar, patient channels, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a small measure of hope. The invitation arrived at Ashworth Hall on a bright, cold morning, carried by a rider wearing the deep green livery of Rothmere Hall. Eleanor watched from the upstairs window as the man dismounted, handed a sealed letter to the housekeeper, and rode off again without waiting for a reply, as though the matter were already settled and no answer but acceptance could possibly be expected. She came downstairs to find her father sitting with the letter open in his lap, his face pale with something that was not entirely illness. "The Duke wishes to call on us," Edmund Ashworth said, his voice thin but steady. "He wishes to discuss the report in person." "With me?" Eleanor took the letter from his hands and read it twice, searching the careful, formal language for some hint of what the Duke actually intended. There was nothing beyond the plain request. He would arrive within the week to discuss the findings regarding the drainage dispute, and he wished to speak directly with the author of the report. "He believes you wrote it," Eleanor said quietly. "He believes a man wrote it," her father corrected, "which is not quite the same thing, though I imagine the difference will matter a great deal to him if he ever learns it." They sat together for a long while after that, the letter resting on the table between them like something that might catch fire if handled carelessly. Elinor had known in some distant way that a moment like this might come. She had written the report knowing it might draw attention, might invite questions, might eventually require her father to sit across from the Duke of Rothmere and answer for knowledge he did not fully possess. She had simply hoped it would not come so soon before she had time to prepare him or herself for what such a meeting would require. "You cannot receive him," she said finally. "You are too unwell. A single conversation about drainage patterns and rainfall records would exhaust you before he finished his first question. And if I do not receive him, what then? He will think Ashworth Hall too proud or too foolish to defend its own findings. He may dismiss the report entirely out of irritation, and Marsh Hollow will flood regardless of how correct our numbers were." Elinor said nothing for a moment, turning the problem over in her mind the way she turned over every difficult stretch of land, looking for the path the water would naturally take if left alone to find it. "Then I will receive him," she said. Her father looked at her sharply. "Elinor, not as the author of the report. As your daughter, managing the house while you rest upstairs, apologizing on your behalf for being unable to receive him properly, offering to answer whatever simple questions I can while promising a fuller conversation once your health allows it." She spoke quickly now, the plan taking shape as she described it, each piece falling into place with the same clean logic she used when tracing water across a map. "He will not suspect anything unusual in that. Daughters manage households when fathers are unwell. It happens everywhere in every county in England. He will simply see a young woman doing what young women are expected to do, and he will have no reason to look any closer. And if his questions require more than a simple answer—" Elinor allowed herself the smallest, tightest smile. "Then I will answer them anyway, and hope he does not notice how simple my answers are not." It was, she knew even as she said it, a dangerous plan built on the assumption that a duke accustomed to being surrounded by deference would not think to question a young woman who offered him tea and quiet, careful conversation. But it was the only plan available to her, and the days remaining before his arrival gave her no time to devise anything better. She spent those days preparing in every way she could think to prepare. She reread her own report until she could recite entire passages without looking at the page. She reviewed the tenant accounts, the rainfall records, the old estate maps, until she felt certain she could answer any question the Duke might ask about the substance of her findings. What she could not prepare for, no matter how many hours she spent trying, was the simple fact of standing in a room with him, a man whose reputation for exacting judgment had followed him across every conversation she had ever overheard about Rothmere Hall. The morning of his arrival was clear and cold, the kind of bright autumn day that made the fields look sharper than usual, every hedgerow and boundary line visible in crisp detail against the pale sky. Elinor dressed carefully but plainly, choosing nothing that might draw attention to itself, and stood in the entrance hall of Ashworth Hall long before the sound of carriage wheels announced the Duke's arrival. When he stepped down from the carriage, she understood immediately why so many descriptions of him focused less on his appearance and more on the manner in which he carried himself. He was not a large man, nor an especially striking one, but he moved with the unmistakable certainty of someone who had never once entered a room and wondered whether he belonged there. He crossed the short distance from the carriage to the front steps with brisk, purposeful strides, and when his eyes finally settled on Elinor waiting in the doorway, there was a flicker of mild surprise, quickly smoothed over into polite formality. "Miss Ashworth," he said, offering a short bow, "I had hoped to speak with your father." "My father is unwell today, Your Grace, and unable to receive visitors for any length of time. He asked me to convey his apologies and to assist you in whatever way I am able, until such time as he can speak with you properly himself." Something in his expression suggested this was not the answer he had been expecting, though he recovered quickly, offering the kind of polite, practiced smile that revealed nothing of what he actually thought. "I see. Then perhaps we might speak briefly regardless. I have some questions regarding the report he sent me." "Of course," Elinor said and led him inside. They settled in the small drawing room that overlooked the eastern fields, the same room where Elinor had spent countless evenings poring over maps and rainfall records long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. The Duke seated himself with the easy confidence of a man used to being received in far grander rooms than this one, and drew the leather case from beneath his arm, setting it on the table between them. Your father's report was thorough, he began without preamble, more thorough than anything my own engineers produced, which I confess surprised me. I have some questions about the rainfall data referenced in the third section. The figures suggest a pattern going back nearly 40 years. I was not aware Ashworth Hall kept records of such length. My grandfather began the practice, Elinor said carefully, choosing her words the way she chose, footing on uneven ground. He believed a single wet season told you very little about a piece of land. Only years of records compared against each other could show you the true pattern beneath the weather. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the sharp attentiveness of a man who had just heard something he had not expected to hear from a young woman offering tea in a modest drawing room. That is precisely the argument made in the report, he said slowly. Nearly word for word. Elinor felt something tighten in her chest, a warning she had not fully anticipated. She had not meant to echo the report so closely. She had simply spoken the truth as she understood it, the way she always spoke when the subject was land and water and the patterns hidden within them. My father has explained his reasoning to me many times, she said, recovering quickly. I have heard the argument often enough to remember it well. It was, she told herself, not entirely a lie. She simply left out the fact that the reasoning had been hers all along, and that her father had learned it from her rather than the reverse. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Elinor forced herself to hold his gaze, though every instinct urged her to look away, to retreat into the safer role of quiet, decorative silence that so many young women in her position were expected to occupy. She did not look away. She had spent too many years standing in flooded fields, arguing with skeptical tenants and unconvinced land agents, to lose her composure now over a single searching glance from a man who did not yet know what he was looking at. You seem to understand the argument quite well yourself, he said finally, and there was something in his tone that was not quite suspicion, not quite admiration, but some uncertain space between the two. I have lived on this land my whole life, Your Grace. It would be strange if I understood nothing of it. He considered this, then let the matter rest, turning instead to a series of more technical questions about the proposed drainage channel, the slope calculations, the specific measurements taken along the boundary line. Elinor answered each question fully, drawing on knowledge so deeply embedded in her that she barely had to search for the words. She spoke of the way water gathered in the lower fields during heavy rain, spreading gently rather than rushing, soaking into ground that had been allowed, for generations, to absorb it slowly. She spoke of the tenant families in Marsh Hollow, of the stories they had shared with her about floods from decades past, before the natural channels had been left undisturbed. With every answer she watched something shift in the Duke's expression, the polite, faintly condescending attentiveness of a man humoring a young woman's conversation slowly giving way to something more careful, more genuinely engaged. He began asking sharper questions, pressing on details, testing the depth of what she claimed to know, and she met every test without faltering because the knowledge was not borrowed. It was hers, built from years of walking the very ground they were discussing. Your father has taught you a great deal, he said at last, leaning back slightly in his chair, studying her with an expression she could not fully read. He has taught me what he knows, Elinor said, which was, in its own careful way, entirely true. The Duke was quiet for a moment, glancing toward the window, toward the field stretching pale gold under the autumn light. I confess I did not expect this conversation to be so useful, he said. I had intended only to confirm a few details before deciding how to proceed. Instead, I find myself reconsidering the entire drainage plan. Something in Elinor's chest loosened, just slightly, the first real breath she had allowed herself since he stepped down from his carriage. Then the report served its purpose. It seems it did. He rose, gathering the leather case, and Elinor rose with him, guiding him back toward the entrance hall. At the door he paused, turning back to look at her with an expression that was, for the first time since his arrival, not entirely guarded. Please tell your father I found the conversation with his daughter nearly as informative as the report itself. It is rare to find a household where the family understands its own land so thoroughly, down to every member of it. Elinor inclined her head, careful to keep her expression neutral, though the compliment landed somewhere it was not meant to land, striking closer to the truth than he could possibly have realized. I will tell him, Your Grace. He left as briskly as he had arrived, the carriage wheels crunching over the gravel drive, and Elinor stood in the doorway watching until the vehicle disappeared around the bend. half relieved, half unsettled by how close the conversation had come to the truth without ever quite touching it. She returned upstairs to find her father waiting anxiously, and recounted the conversation in careful detail, watching relief and something like quiet pride move across his tired features. "He suspects nothing," her father said. "He suspects something," Alina corrected. "He simply has not yet decided what to make of it." That night, unable to sleep, she stood at her window looking out over the dark fields toward the distant boundary line, thinking not of the drainage dispute, which now seemed likely to resolve in the tenant's favor, but of the Duke's face as he had studied her across the drawing room, searching for something he could not quite name. She had built her entire strategy on the assumption that he would see nothing beyond what he expected to see, a dutiful daughter managing her father's household. But she had watched his eyes sharpen with every answer she gave, watched him lean forward instead of away, watched the polite condescension slowly replaced by something far more attentive. She told herself this was simply the natural curiosity of an intelligent man confronted with an unexpectedly informed conversation. She told herself it meant nothing beyond that. She was not entirely certain she believed it, and that uncertainty, more than anything else that had happened that day, kept her awake long after the house had gone silent around her. Winter arrived early that year, settling over the county with a hard, silvered frost that stiffened the grass and turned the boundary streams to thin ribbons of ice. The drainage dispute, which Alina had hoped might resolve quietly within a matter of weeks, instead stretched on through a slow, uneasy negotiation between Rothmere Hall and Ashworth Hall, conducted mostly through letters, occasional visits from the Duke's land agent, and one further meeting between the Duke himself and Alina, who continued to present herself as her father's dutiful intermediary. It was during this stretch of careful, patient negotiation that Alina began to notice how often her path crossed with the Duke's, in ways that felt less and less like coincidence. The first time she told herself it truly was chance. She had ridden out early one frosted morning to check the water levels near Marsh Hollow, following the same route she had followed 100 times before, when she came upon Julian Rothmere standing alone at the edge of his own land, studying the frozen boundary stream with an expression of quiet, focused attention that surprised her. He was not accompanied by engineers or agents or any of the usual retinue that seemed to follow him everywhere. He was simply standing there, alone in the cold morning air, looking at the water the way she looked at it, as though it held answers worth searching for. He noticed her before she could turn her horse away unseen. "Miss Ashworth," he inclined his head, and there was something almost sheepish in the gesture, as though he had been caught doing something he did not wish explained. "I did not expect to find company out here this early." "Nor I, your grace," Alina said, guiding her horse closer despite every instinct urging caution. "I did not realize Dukes inspected their own boundary streams personally. I assumed that work belonged to engineers." A faint, unexpected smile crossed his face. "It usually does, but your father's report made me curious about things I had never bothered to look at myself. I wished to see the water for myself, rather than simply reading about it on a page." Alina dismounted, unable to resist the pull of a conversation that touched so closely on the subject she cared about most. They walked the frozen edge of the stream together for nearly an hour that morning, discussing the way ice formed differently depending on the slope of the ground beneath it, the way certain sections of the boundary froze solid, while others remained soft and yielding even in the hardest frost. The Duke asked question after question, and Alina answered each one with the easy familiarity of someone discussing an old, well-loved friend, rather than a mere feature of the landscape. It was only as she rode home afterward, the cold air stinging her cheeks, that she allowed herself to acknowledge how thoroughly she had enjoyed the conversation, and how unsettling that enjoyment felt. The second meeting, a week later, was harder to explain away as chance. She had gone to the village to collect supplies and found the Duke's carriage already stopped outside the small stone chapel, the Duke himself standing nearby in conversation with the local vicar. He excused himself from the conversation the moment he saw her, crossing the muddy street with a directness that left little room to believe the meeting was accidental. "I had hoped I might encounter you here," he admitted, before she could offer any polite greeting. "I have been considering the report further, and I find myself with questions your father may not be well enough to answer at length. I wondered if you might be willing to walk with me a short distance and share your thoughts." Alina hesitated only briefly before agreeing, telling herself, as she had told herself before, that this was simply the continuation of necessary negotiations regarding the estate. They walked together along the frozen lane leading out of the village, and their conversation drifted, gradually and almost without her noticing, away from drainage patterns and rainfall records and towards subjects that had nothing to do with the dispute at all. He asked about her grandfather, the man who had begun the estate's long tradition of rainfall records, and Alina found herself telling him stories she had not shared with anyone in years, stories of a man who had taught her to read the sky the way other people read books, who had walked her across every field on the estate before she was old enough to understand why any of it mattered. She asked in turn about his own upbringing, about the pressures of inheriting an estate as vast as Rothmere while barely out of boyhood, and was surprised to hear something almost weary in his answer, a rare crack of honesty in a man she had assumed incapable of admitting any uncertainty at all. "I was raised to believe that a duke's judgment must never be questioned," he said, staring ahead at the frost-covered lane. "That doubt itself was a kind of weakness unbecoming of the title. It has made me, I think, rather quick to dismiss opinions that do not immediately confirm what I already believe." "And has that served you well?" Alina asked before she could stop herself. He glanced at her, something flickering across his face that might have been surprise, or might have been the faint beginning of amusement. "Not always. Your father's report was proof enough of that. I very nearly dismissed it without a second reading, simply because it arrived without the credentials I expected from serious engineering work. I am fortunate I did not." Alina said nothing to that, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest, a quiet reminder of exactly how close the truth still sat beneath every conversation they shared. She was fortunate too, though for reasons he could not begin to guess. Over the following weeks, these encounters became less rare and less easily dismissed as coincidence. The Duke found reasons to visit the boundary line more often than any reasonable engineering concern required. He found reasons to attend village events he had never attended before, small gatherings that brought him within easy reach of conversation with Alina, who found herself, despite every warning voice in her own mind, looking forward to these meetings more than she was willing to admit even to herself. It was during one such meeting, held in the small library at Ashworth Hall while her father rested upstairs, that the conversation turned in a direction Alina had not anticipated and could not easily steer away from. They had been discussing, once again, the drainage report, the Duke turning over a particular passage regarding the tenant accounts from Marsh Hollow, when he set the pages down and looked at her with an expression more searching than any he had worn before. "I find myself curious about something," he said slowly, "and I hope you will forgive the bluntness of the question. The language in this passage, describing the tenant conversations, the tone of it, the specific concern for how the families themselves experienced the earlier floods. It does not read like the writing of an engineer or even a land agent. It reads like the writing of someone who sat in those kitchens and genuinely listened. I confess I struggle to picture your father, in his current state of health, undertaking such visits himself." Alina felt the careful composure she had maintained for months threaten to slip, just slightly, beneath the weight of a question that came far closer to the truth than any before it. "My father has always cared deeply for the tenants," she said carefully. "Even before his illness, he insisted that any decision affecting their homes be made only after speaking with them directly." "That is admirable," the Duke said, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied with the answer. "And yet the report was written recently, was it not? After his illness had already taken firm hold." Alina met his gaze steadily, forcing her voice to remain calm even as her thoughts raced ahead of her, searching for the safest path through a conversation that had suddenly become far more dangerous than any discussion of drainage patterns. "My father dictated much of it. I assisted him with the writing, where his strength did not allow him to hold a pen for long." It was, she realized even as she said it, the closest she had come yet to the truth, a careful half-admission offered in the hope that it might satisfy his curiosity without revealing the full shape of what lay beneath it. For a long moment, the Duke said nothing, studying her with an expression she could not fully read, something between suspicion and reluctant respect, as though he sensed there was more to the story than she was offering but could not quite bring himself to press further. "You assisted him a great deal then," he said finally. "I did what any daughter would do in my position." He held her gaze a moment longer, then let the matter rest, though Alina did not miss the way his eyes lingered on the report still sitting between them on the table, nor the way he glanced at her hands, at the ink stains that no amount of careful washing had ever fully removed from her fingers, evidence of countless hours spent bent over ledgers and reports that were never meant to bear her name. If he noticed the ink stains, he said nothing of it that day. But Elinor left the conversation with the uncomfortable certainty that something in the careful architecture of her secret had begun to crack, however slightly, and that it was only a matter of time before the entire structure gave way beneath the weight of his growing curiosity. That evening, sitting with her father in the quiet of the drawing room, she recounted the conversation in full, watching his expression grow troubled as she described how closely the Duke's questions had circled the truth. "He suspects," her father said quietly. "He suspects something," Elinor agreed. "Whether he suspects the full truth, I cannot say. But he is not a foolish man, and foolish men do not notice the things he has begun noticing. And if he discovers it—" Elinor was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low fire burning in the grate, thinking of every conversation she had shared with Julian Rothmere over the past weeks, the walks along the frozen boundary stream, the unexpected honesty in his voice when he spoke of his own upbringing, the careful, searching way he had looked at her that afternoon in the library. "I do not know," she said finally. "I do not know whether he will see a woman who deceived him, or a woman who did what needed to be done because no other path was open to her. I suspect it depends a great deal on which version of himself he chooses to be in that moment. The one raised to believe his judgment must never be questioned, or the one who stood alone at the boundary stream that morning, simply looking at the water, willing to learn something new." Her father studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and faintly sad moving across his tired features. "You have grown fond of him," he said. It was not a question. Elinor did not answer immediately, and in the silence that followed she understood, with a clarity that unsettled her far more than any question the Duke had asked that day, that her father had not been wrong. Outside, the frost thickened over the fields, and somewhere beyond the dark boundary line, in the quiet rooms of Rothmere Hall, Julian Rothmere sat awake far longer than usual, turning over in his mind the strange, persistent feeling that something essential about Elinor Ashworth remained hidden just beneath the surface of every conversation they shared, close enough to sense, too elusive yet to name. He did not yet know what that something was, but the not knowing had begun, quietly and without his full awareness, to matter to him a great deal more than the drainage dispute that had first brought her name to his attention. The chance meeting that changed everything did not feel like chance at all when it happened, though afterward Elinor would wonder whether some part of her had wanted to be found out, tired at last of carrying a secret that had grown heavier with every week that passed. It began with a letter, delivered to Ashworth Hall on a grey morning in late winter, informing Edmund Ashworth that the Duke wished to hold a small gathering at Rothmere Hall to formally announce the resolution of the drainage dispute. The new plan, developed jointly between the two estates, would preserve the natural channels through the lower fields while adding careful, modest reinforcements to protect against the heaviest storms. It was, in every measurable sense, exactly the outcome Elinor had worked so hard to secure, and she should have felt nothing but relief reading the letter's careful, formal language. Instead, she felt only a tightening dread, because the letter made clear that Edmund Ashworth himself was expected to attend, to stand before the assembled tenants and neighboring landowners and receive credit for work he had never done. "I cannot go," her father said, when Elinor read him the letter that evening. His voice was weaker than it had been even a week earlier, the illness tightening its grip with a speed that frightened her more than she allowed herself to show. "I could not stand through such a gathering. I could not answer questions, could not accept congratulations for work I do not fully understand. Then I will go in your place, as I have gone before." "This is different, Elinor. This is not a quiet conversation in our own drawing room. This will be a room full of people, all of them believing your father solved a problem his own daughter solved for him. If the Duke asks you a direct question in front of witnesses, a question only the true author of that report could answer fully, what will you do then?" Elinor did not have an answer for that, not one she was willing to speak aloud. She spent the following days in a state of quiet, focused dread, rehearsing every possible question the Duke might ask, preparing careful, deflecting answers for each one, though some stubborn, exhausted part of her had already begun to suspect that no amount of preparation would be enough. The day of the gathering arrived cold and clear, the fields around Rothmere Hall glittering with frost beneath a pale winter sun. Elena rode alone, her father too unwell even to make the short journey by carriage, and arrived to find the grand house already filled with the low hum of conversation, tenants from both estates mixing uneasily with landowners and agents, all of them gathered to witness the formal resolution of a dispute that had for months threatened the safety of homes on both sides of the boundary line. She found the Duke near the center of the gathering, speaking with several of the Marsh Hollow tenant families, and something in the sight of him standing among them, listening carefully to their concerns rather than simply dismissing them, struck her more forcefully than she expected. He had changed, she realized, in the month since he first opened her report at his desk, dismissing it as the work of some anonymous clerk. He listened now in a way he had not listened before. He noticed her arrival and crossed the room to greet her, his expression warm in a way that made the dread in her chest tighten further rather than ease. "Miss Ashworth, I regret your father could not join us today, but I understand his health does not allow it. Perhaps you would do me the honor of standing beside me when I address the gathering. It seems fitting that Ashworth Hall be properly represented." She could not refuse without drawing exactly the kind of attention she had spent months trying to avoid, so she agreed, and found herself standing at the edge of the great hall a short time later as the Duke called for quiet and began to address the assembled crowd. He spoke well, she had to admit, praising the careful work that had resolved the dispute, acknowledging the concerns of the Marsh Hollow families with a sincerity that felt genuine rather than merely polite. And then, turning toward her with an expression of open, public gratitude, he said the words that Elena had feared from the very beginning. None of this would have been possible without the extraordinary work of Edmund Ashworth, whose report identified concerns my own engineers had entirely overlooked. I owe him a debt of gratitude, and I am pleased that his daughter could join us today to receive that gratitude on his behalf, given his continued ill health. A murmur of polite approval moved through the crowd, and Elena felt every eye in the room settle briefly upon her, waiting for some response, some gracious acknowledgement of praise that belonged, in truth, entirely to her and not at all to her father. It was at that exact moment, standing at the edge of the crowded hall with every face turned toward her, that Hargrove, the Duke's steward, approached quietly from the side, carrying a small stack of papers he had been asked to retrieve from the estate office. Among them, visible on top of the stack in his hands, was a page Elena recognized instantly, with a jolt of pure, cold panic, because it was a page from an early draft of the very report the Duke had just praised, a draft she had accidentally left behind during her second visit to Rothmere Hall weeks earlier, tucked mistakenly among other documents she had been reviewing. The page bore, unmistakably, her own handwriting. Hargrove, unaware of the significance of what he carried, offered the stack to the Duke, murmuring something about documents requiring his signature. The Duke glanced down absently, still mid-conversation with a nearby landowner, and it was only as his eyes drifted across the top page that his words trailed off entirely, his expression shifting from easy, practiced hospitality into something far more focused and still. He recognized the handwriting immediately. He had spent enough hours, in recent months, reading letters exchanged with Elena regarding minor estate matters to know her hand as well as his own. And the words on that page, describing rainfall patterns and tenant accounts in language nearly identical to passages from the original report, could not possibly belong to anyone else. The room continued its low hum of conversation around them, entirely unaware of the silent, seismic shift taking place at its center. The Duke looked up from the page slowly, his eyes finding Elena's across the small distance separating them, and in that look she saw every careful lie she had constructed over the past months crumble at once, laid bare by nothing more than an accident of misplaced paper. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it clearly over the surrounding noise, though the careful control in it did nothing to soften the weight of what followed. "Might I trouble you for a private word?" It was not truly a question, and Elena understood, with the sinking certainty of someone watching a carefully built structure finally give way, that there was no answer available to her now except the truth. The private study to which the Duke led her was quiet, removed from the noise of the gathering by a long corridor and a heavy oak door that he closed firmly behind them. He set the stack of papers down on his desk, the single incriminating page still resting on top, and turned to face her with an expression she had never seen on him before, stripped entirely of the polished composure he wore in every public setting. "I would like you to explain this," he said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that suggested considerable effort. "And I would ask that you not insult either of us with further half-truths." Elinor stood very still, her heart pounding, aware that every careful strategy she had relied upon for months had finally run out of road. There was nowhere left to retreat, no clever deflection that would hold beneath the weight of the page sitting on his desk, written in her own unmistakable hand. "I wrote the report," she said finally, the words feeling strange after so many months of carefully avoiding them. "All of it, the rainfall analysis, the tenant accounts, the drainage calculations. My father signed his name because a report from a woman would never have reached your desk, let alone your attention. You would have dismissed it before reading a single page." She had expected anger and braced herself for it, but what crossed the Duke's face instead was something more complicated, a mixture of disbelief and something almost like hurt, as though the deception troubled him more deeply than the substance of what she had actually done. "You allowed me to believe your father wrote this. You allowed me to praise him publicly, in front of half the county, for work that was entirely yours." "I did what was necessary to protect the tenant families," Elinor said, and though her voice remained steady, something fierce had crept into it now, months of carefully suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. "You said it yourself, Your Grace, the very first time you read the report, though you did not know it was said of me. This is a man's work, you told your steward, careful, disciplined. You could not imagine that a woman had written it, and so I made certain you never had to imagine it. I let you believe exactly what you wanted to believe, because the alternative was watching you dismiss months of careful work simply because of who had done it." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the page still resting between them on the desk. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by something more uncertain. "You heard me say that. Hargrove repeats very little to very few people, Your Grace, but even careful men occasionally speak more freely than they intend, and word travels quickly on an estate as small as ours." It was not entirely the truth. She had pieced together the Duke's early dismissal from fragments overheard through her father's few remaining contacts among the household staff, but she offered it now without apology, letting him understand exactly how deeply his careless words had reached her. He turned away from her then, walking to the window that overlooked the frost-covered gardens below, and stood there in silence for a long moment, his shoulders tense beneath his coat. Elinor watched him, uncertain whether to speak further or allow the silence to stretch, uncertain which choice would serve her better in a moment that had already spun so far beyond her control. "I have spent months," he said finally, still facing the window, "believing I was corresponding with a capable land agent, hired quietly by your father to manage business he could no longer manage himself. I built an entire understanding of this dispute around that belief. And every conversation I found myself most drawn to, every walk along the boundary stream, every unexpected pleasure in discussing rainfall patterns and tenant welfare with far more depth than the subject strictly required, all of it happened not with some hired agent, but with you." Something in his tone, quiet and unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before, caught Elinor off guard entirely. She had prepared herself for anger, for wounded pride, for the cold dismissal she had feared from the very beginning. She had not prepared for this, for the strange, raw honesty of a man confronting not only her deception but his own blindness within it. "I did not deceive you regarding anything that mattered," she said carefully. "Every word in that report was true. Every measurement, every account from the tenant families, every recommendation. The only thing I concealed was whose hand had written it, and I concealed that because your world would not have accepted the truth on its own terms." He turned back to face her at last, and the look in his eyes was not the look she had feared. It was something closer to reckoning, a man forced to confront the narrowness of his own assumptions and finding the confrontation more uncomfortable than he had expected. "This is a man's work," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the foolishness of his own earlier words for the first time. "I said that to Hargrove without a moment's hesitation, entirely certain of it, because I could not imagine any other explanation for work of that quality. I have spent my whole life believing my judgment could be trusted precisely, because it had never once been seriously tested by someone I did not expect to challenge it." "And has it been tested now?" Elinor asked, unable to keep a faint, bitter edge from creeping into her voice. "Thoroughly," he admitted, and something almost like a rueful smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not fully reach his eyes. "More thoroughly than I care to admit." They stood facing each other across the small study, the noise of the gathering still audible faintly through the heavy door, and Alina felt the full weight of the moment settle over her, uncertain whether what came next would be dismissal, disgrace, or something else entirely that she had not yet allowed herself to imagine. "What happens now, Your Grace?" she asked finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel unbearable. The Duke did not answer immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she could not fully read, some private struggle between the man he had been raised to be and the man he was, standing in that quiet room, beginning, however reluctantly, to become. "I do not know," he admitted at last, and the honesty in the admission surprised her nearly as much as anything else that had happened that day. "I have never before had to decide what to do with a truth this inconvenient to everything I believed I understood." News of what had happened in the private study did not stay private for long, though the version that spread through the gathering downstairs was, mercifully, a distorted and incomplete one. Servants noticed the Duke's unusually long absence from his own gathering. Hargrove, aware of exactly what page he had carried into that room, said nothing to anyone, but his careful silence did little to stop the low murmur of speculation that always follows when a duke disappears for the better part of an hour with a young, unmarried woman from a neighboring estate. By the time Alina returned home that evening, exhausted and shaken in ways she had not expected, word had already reached Ashworth Hall that something significant had occurred at Rothmere Hall that afternoon, though the details remained mercifully vague. Her father, waiting anxiously by the fire, listened to her account of the confrontation with an expression that shifted from fear to something more complicated as she described the Duke's reaction. "He did not dismiss you from the room," her father said slowly when she finished. "He did not send word to ruin our family's standing or demand repayment for the credit falsely given. He simply admitted he did not know what to do." "That is what troubles me most," Alina admitted, sitting heavily in the chair across from him, the events of the day finally catching up with her exhausted body. "I had prepared myself for anger. I had prepared myself for disgrace. I had not prepared myself for a man standing quietly at a window, questioning the foundations of everything he believed about who is capable of careful, disciplined thought." Her father studied her for a long moment, the firelight softening the deep lines of illness that had settled over his face in recent months. "And what do you believe will come of it?" Alina did not have an answer, not that evening, and the days that followed offered no immediate clarity. No letter arrived from Rothmere Hall condemning the family's deception, but neither did any letter arrive offering forgiveness or resolution. The silence stretched for nearly 2 weeks, each day heavier than the last, until Alina found herself checking the road from the village window each morning with a mixture of dread and something she was reluctant to name, watching for a rider who did not come. When word finally did arrive, it came not as a letter but as the Duke himself, arriving unannounced on a gray, quiet afternoon, his carriage pulling up the drive without the usual retinue of attendants that typically surrounded his visits. Alina met him at the door herself, uncertain what expression to prepare for, and found instead a man who looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely uncertain of his own footing. "I have spent 2 weeks trying to decide what I owed you," he said without preamble, standing in the cold doorway of Ashworth Hall as though he had rehearsed the words the entire ride over and feared losing his nerve if he waited any longer to speak them. "An apology seemed insufficient, given the scale of what I failed to understand about you, about the report, about the assumptions I have carried my entire life without ever once being forced to examine them." Alina said nothing, waiting, uncertain where this was leading. "I have decided," he continued, "that an apology alone would be a kind of cowardice, a quiet, private admission that changes nothing beyond how I feel about my own conduct. It does not correct the public record. It does not credit the work to the person who actually did it. It simply allows me to feel better about my mistake while you continue carrying the consequences of it." "What are you proposing, Your Grace?" "That the credit be corrected, properly, publicly, in whatever manner you believe would cause the least difficulty for your family while still ensuring the truth is known. I will not pretend this carries no risk for you. I understand the world we live in does not easily accept the idea that a woman authored work of this quality, and I understand some will judge you unkindly for it regardless of how the correction is presented. But I no longer believe it is my place to protect you from that judgment by continuing to hide the truth. That decision belongs to you, not to me." Elinor studied him carefully, searching his face for the condescension she had half expected to find, the kind of performative contrition that changed nothing beneath its polished surface. She did not find it. What she found instead was a man genuinely wrestling with the discomfort of his own past certainty, offering not a solution dictated from above but a choice placed, for the first time, entirely in her hands. "I will need to think on it," she said finally. "Of course," he answered, and something in his voice suggested relief rather than impatience, as though her caution confirmed something he had hoped to be true about her. "Take whatever time you require. I am not asking you to decide today. I am only asking you to know that whatever you decide, I intend to honor it, and I intend to stop pretending I understand a world I have clearly understood far less thoroughly than I once believed." He left shortly after without pressing further, and Elinor stood in the doorway long after his carriage had disappeared, turning his words over carefully, searching them for hidden motives and finding, to her genuine surprise, none that she could identify. That night she sat with her father by the fire once more, describing the conversation in full, and watched him listen with an expression of quiet, careful thought. "He is offering you something rare," her father said finally. "Not forgiveness for a wrong he believes you committed, but genuine reckoning with a wrong he committed himself. Few men in his position would manage it." "Few men in his position would need to," Elinor said, though there was less bitterness in the words than there might once have been. Her father smiled faintly, the expression softening the exhaustion in his face. "Perhaps, but he is managing it now, and that is not nothing, Elinor. That is not nothing at all." She sat with the truth of that for a long while after her father had retired for the night, staring into the dying fire, thinking not of drainage patterns or tenant welfare or careful, disciplined reports, but of a man standing at a window admitting for the first time in his life that he did not know what to do, and choosing in the end to let her decide rather than deciding for her. It was a small thing, perhaps, set against the scale of everything that had happened between them. But small things, she had learned from years of watching water find its patient way across even the most stubborn ground, had a way of shifting the entire course of what followed. Elinor took nearly 3 weeks to decide, and during that time her father's health began to fail more visibly than it had in months, as though the long strain of the secret finally released had allowed some part of him to rest at last, and in resting to weaken. She spent her days at his bedside more often than in the fields, and it was during one of those long, quiet afternoons, sitting beside him as he drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, that she finally reached her decision. She would not hide any longer, not for the estate's reputation, not for her father's pride, not for the comfort of a world that preferred its capable minds to arrive in familiar shapes. She had spent 3 years proving, quietly and without credit, that she understood this land as well as anyone who had ever walked it. She was tired of proving it in whispers. She sent word to Rothmere Hall, requesting a meeting, and the Duke arrived the following morning with a promptness that suggested he had been waiting, as she had, for the silence between them to finally break. They met again in the same small drawing room where their first careful conversation had taken place, months earlier, when Elinor had answered his questions with borrowed authority, and he had left believing he had spoken with nothing more than a dutiful daughter. So much had shifted since that first meeting that the room itself seemed different to her now, though nothing in it had changed at all. "I have decided," she said once they were seated, "that I want the truth known, not quietly corrected through some private arrangement between our two families, but known properly, in whatever manner ensures the tenant families understand exactly who fought for the resolution that protected their homes." The Duke nodded slowly, though she could see him weighing the difficulty of what she was proposing. "It will not be simple. There will be those who refuse to believe it, and those who believe it and resent you for it regardless. I would be lying if I promised you an easy path." "I did not ask for an easy path, Your Grace. I asked for an honest one." Something in his expression shifted then, something that looked almost like admiration allowed to surface fully for the first time, without the careful guardedness he had maintained through every previous conversation. "Then we will find a way to make it honest," he said. "Together, if you will allow it." What followed was neither simple nor entirely comfortable, exactly as he had warned. The Duke arranged a second gathering at Rothmere Hall, smaller than the first, attended by the tenant families most directly affected by the drainage dispute, along with a handful of respected landowners whose good opinion mattered to the future standing of both estates. He spoke plainly this time, without the polished, comfortable narrative he had offered at the first gathering, explaining that the report which had resolved the dispute, and the careful, patient work that had prevented the flooding of Marsh Hollow belonged not to Edmund Ashworth but to his daughter, who had walked the boundary lines herself, spoken with the tenant families herself, and written every careful page herself, because the world had left her no other path to be heard. The reaction was not universally warm. Some of the assembled landowners exchanged uneasy glances, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with what they had always believed about who was capable of such careful, disciplined thought. A few offered polite but clearly strained congratulations, the kind that concealed more discomfort than approval. But the tenant families from Marsh Hollow, the very people whose homes had been protected by Eleanor's careful work, reacted differently entirely. They came to her afterward, one family at a time, offering a warmth and genuine gratitude that mattered to her far more than the approval of any landowner ever could. An older woman from the Marsh family, whose cottage sat closest to the boundary line and would have flooded first had the original drainage plan gone forward, took Eleanor's hands in her own and held them for a long moment, her eyes bright with something between tears and fierce pride. "We always wondered," the woman said quietly, "how a man too ill to walk his own fields came to know them so well. Some of us suspected the truth long before today. We are glad to see it spoken aloud at last, and gladder still that you were the one who did the work, because no one who did not truly love this land could have written what you wrote." Eleanor found she could not answer immediately, her throat tight with an emotion she had not expected, months of careful concealment finally giving way to something that felt, for the first time, like genuine relief rather than mere survival. In the weeks that followed, the county slowly absorbed the truth in the way counties absorb any unexpected disruption to their comfortable assumptions, with a mixture of gossip, grudging respect, and the occasional pointed unkindness from those who preferred their world to remain exactly as they had always understood it. Eleanor bore the unkindness with the same steady patience she had brought to every flooded field and skeptical tenant she had ever faced, refusing to let it diminish the genuine satisfaction of no longer having to hide the shape of her own mind. Her father's health continued its slow decline through that difficult season, though he lived long enough to see the tenant families of Marsh Hollow settle into a spring untouched by the flooding that had threatened them for so long, and long enough to see his daughter's name spoken at last with the respect it had always deserved. He died peacefully that summer, with Eleanor at his side, and among his final words to her, spoken in a voice grown thin but still clear with conviction, was a simple acknowledgement that had taken him far too long to offer freely. "You were always the one who understood this land," he told her. "I am only sorry it took me, and the rest of the world, so long to say so plainly." Eleanor inherited the management of Ashworth Hall in full afterward, no longer required to hide behind any signature but her own, and the estate she governed in the years that followed became known, quietly but steadily, throughout the county as one of the best managed properties in the region, its drainage patterns carefully maintained, its tenant families consulted rather than merely governed, its records kept with the same painstaking precision her grandfather had begun, and her father had continued, and she herself had, all along, truly perfected. Julian Rothmere remained a frequent presence at Ashworth Hall through those years, his visits growing less connected to any remaining business between the two estates and more clearly rooted in something neither of them rushed to name aloud, though both understood it well enough. He had changed, in the time since that first careless remark to his steward, in ways that went beyond a single corrected credit or a single public acknowledgement. He had learned, slowly and not without discomfort, to question the easy assumptions his position had always allowed him to hold, and to recognize careful, disciplined thought wherever it appeared, regardless of the shape it arrived in. Years later, when their own daughter was born and grew old enough to walk the boundary lines beside her mother, Eleanor made certain the girl learned every pattern the land had to teach, the way water gathered and spread, the way ice formed differently across uneven ground, the careful, patient logic hidden beneath every storm. She made certain, too, that the girl grew up in a world slightly more willing than the one Eleanor herself had known, to believe that such careful, disciplined understanding could belong to anyone patient enough to earn it, regardless of what name happened to be signed at the bottom of the page. The report itself, the original 40 pages that had once traveled to Rothmere Hall carrying a name that was not its true author's own, remained preserved in the Ashworth Hall library for the rest of Eleanor's long life, no longer hidden, no longer requiring any careful fiction to be read and respected exactly as it deserved. Visitors to the estate in later years were sometimes shown the document and told, plainly and without embarrassment, the full story of the young woman who had written it, and the Duke who had once looked at her work and called it a man's before learning, through patient reckoning with his own mistaken certainty, precisely how much that careless phrase had nearly cost them both.